Everyone, this is the second panel today. This is on political and institutional constraints to migration and displacement. And after the fabulous and fascinating first panel, I can almost guarantee you that this panel will match the excitement and the novelty of the previous one. My name is Piroska Mohácsi Nagy. Obviously, I'm not Gibril Faal as a chair, as you see it in the program. Gibril will have to leave a little bit earlier due to a flight out of Beirut. And therefore, I'm chairing this panel, and he will be actually our first speaker. Gibril is a visiting professor in practice in LSE at our institute. He is also a global player at the migration arena, policy arena. He is a major advisor and contributor, for example, to the Global Forum for Development and Migration. He is a co-founder and director of ADEPT, which is a very unique, sort of innovative platform for diaspora between Europe and Africa. Without further ado, and in the interest of time, Gibril, I would ask you to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Piroska, and thank you, AUB and LSE, for having me here. The topic is to look at the political and institutional constraints to migration and displacement. I have three broad comments I want to make. One is the general constraints, then one major political constraint, and then institutional. To begin with, I would observe that almost all migration or mobility or displacement can be summarized as being caused by what I call the 5 L's. People move either to protect life, limb, and liberty, or to pursue the enhancement of livelihood or lifestyles. So displacement or refugees or involuntary migration is usually to protect life, limb, or liberty. And so-called economic migration is to seek to enhance lifestyles or livelihood. So what is the general constraint? I think the general constraint is, as nation states, as communities, are we all okay with this? Are we really okay that people should move to protect life, limb, or liberty? And are we okay that people should move to enhance livelihood and lifestyle? Ordinarily, people would think the answer is yes. But I think we should not take it for granted, because the practice tells us that because we are settled in nation states, in communities where we have the in and the out, and this is so fundamentally linked to the psyche of human beings, of those who belong and those who don't, I don't think we should take it as natural that everybody would accept that mobility in this sense is a good thing. So that means we have to make a case for it. And this sounds cynical, but we have to make a case as often as possible that it is okay to move to protect life, limb, and liberty, and it is okay to move to enhance livelihood and lifestyles. So that's the broad, in my view, general approach to dealing with the constraints. Are we all on the same page? Then if we look at the question of what do we do in practice, this means that we need to, universities and others need to bring in things that are no longer fashionable. For example, to talk about and make a case about the sisterhood and brotherhood of mankind, we almost need a new wave of hippies, whereby we spread the word that we need to love each other and it is okay to do that. Because there is an alternative narrative that's telling us that it is not okay to be together, and there's an almost dystopian sort of alternative being spread. So we do have to purposefully go out and make the idiotic case that human beings should love each other. On political constraint, if then, let's make an assumption that most nation states then agree that it's okay for mobility to happen, then what are the major political constraints? It is actually more difficult for democratic countries than non-democratic ones, because in a dictatorship, the dictator would wake up and say, this is what's going to happen. Either we would have migrants in or we'll deport all of them. It's always a decision by a small number of people. In democracies, in Western democracies particularly, where we've been seeing the reluctance to open up the doors, some very well-meaning politicians think that if they open up or if they are seen to be pro-migration, that it would lose them the vote. Now, my view is we cannot say to those politicians that they have to go with the popular vote. But we cannot also say to them that they should use an approach whereby they would lose the election. Because some of our friends who are pro-migration to an extent, if they lose the election, then what little we thought we could get, we won't get anymore. So I'm reminded by the Peter Drucker saying about the difference between a leader and a manager, that a leader is someone who does the right thing, and a manager is someone who does things right. So in my view, on this one, we have to push our leaders more to becoming leaders, in which case, and it is not always the case that making a difficult case would mean they would lose the elections. I'll give you an example. In most Western European countries, most of the population would like to see the death penalty reintroduced, and virtually no politician would accept that. All politicians on the mainstream would say, no, we disagree with you. We will not have the death penalty. That's an extreme case, but it's the point being made that you don't necessarily win elections just by pandering to. Leadership also assumes that sometimes you're saying, you may not like this, but this is where we have to go. So that's the big, in my view, political constraint. Then what's the institutional constraint? I think the big institutional constraint is the very institution that is political parties and governments that are supposed to deal with this persuasion of people are not necessarily trained to or skilled in doing that. If I'm looking at the best manipulators, to put it crudely, of public opinion, I'm not necessarily going to look at government or political parties who do that. Who do I look for who are able to do that? Well, you may not like the answer. It's marketeers and advertisers, people in business who have managed to find the skills and the technique. Every day, me and you would wake up every day minding our own business, and a marketeer somewhere would convince us to buy things we do not want with money which we do not have. Every day we fall for it. Now, I don't care what their motivation is. I'm interested in that skill. I'm interested in that skill so that I would convince nation states and communities that it is okay to give refuge to people who are fleeing persecution, that it is okay for low-skilled migrants who want to improve their economic livelihood, it is okay for them to move to a different country to seek that. And for that, we need a different set of skills in the institutions that are tasked to undertake these most great of responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Gibril. You highlighted the pragmatism with which we have to approach very complex political situations. And in addition to communications that was identified in the previous channel, you stressed that there are skills to be looked at and considered from the business community to achieve what we feel are the right goals. Now I turn the floor to Carmen Geha. She's next to me. She's an assistant professor of public administration here at the AUB. And she gave, I recall, a few months ago, a fascinating talk about the political setting here in Lebanon, in the Lebanese, special Lebanese context. We look forward to your presentation this time around as well.
Yeah, can you hear me? So good morning to those of you coming from outside Lebanon. Welcome to Lebanon, welcome to AUB. I have the not so easy task to speak about the Syrian refugee crisis in the case of Lebanon by addressing its political dimensions and the politics of the crisis. And is Thaer still here? I could make this a very short academic talk and just say hashtag Hariri, hashtag Saudi, hashtag what happened this weekend, and just stop at that and get your feedback. So obviously there's a lot of politics around this crisis. This is very different, although I like the comparative angle, but this is a very different context than refugees arriving in Europe. And I'll just start by posing some general questions I thought about in the morning when addressing the political. We're using a lot the word policy. We want to inform policy and policy makers, but the politics of the case in Lebanon is so informal. We heard in the first panel, unwritten, informal, no policy. There is an effort on the part of the Lebanese government to disassociate itself. So how do we do policy, and how is policy constructed? And I come at this by looking at the political system in Lebanon. It is a sectarian, it's an ethno-nationalist power-sharing system, and that has very particular implications on how policy is constructed or not constructed. What can universities do about politics? Can we address the political large P? Do we have the pedagogies to address the politics of the crisis? And I think that the politics of the crisis plays out in 4 ways in the case of Lebanon. Number one, really, in enabling the Lebanese political system to continue to upgrade itself, right? So even during the crisis, we see that there were 2 years of political vacuum. The Lebanese crisis response plan issued by the Lebanese government doesn't come out until year 4 of the crisis. So there is a deadlock. At the same time, the system is so much able to upgrade itself, both in the international scene and in the local scene. So that's one way in which politics plays out. It enables politicians to come together or not come together in times of crisis. And second, in waves of aid. So the political also plays out very, very well in the different waves and the different focuses of aid that Lebanon went through. So moving from humanitarian, moving to language around social cohesion, and then Lebanese politicians noting that they would rather not look at cohesion but look more at stability. So this change, and now we are into development. We're in the 4th phase of aid. And third, also in invigorating the NGOization of the response crisis. There is a deliberate outsourcing and a deliberate shift in the work of NGOs to focus on that, which brings me also to the other way in which the politics plays out, which is the politics of local governance, where municipalities become the nexus of policy and the nexus of response rather than central government. And lastly, obviously, the political aspect plays out in discourse and sectarian tensions, and I think that we have seen a rise of that in the last few months. So 2 sides of the questions before I move on to my own research is like, how did the crisis affect the political system in Lebanon, but also how did the political system affect the ability of Lebanon to respond to the crisis? And do we have the tools to address that question? My own work looks at the question and validity of political resilience in times of deadlock and in times of crisis. There's an emerging literature on resilience, politics, and what does resilience mean? What are we looking at in order to determine that the system is resilient? And I'm looking at the politics of it, and I'm saying that what remains under-theorized is resilience when there is a no consensus, when there is a crisis. So resilience, is Lebanon resilient when the tool of the policy of disassociation, Ba'abda Declaration, is broken less than a year after, when Hezbollah has, is militarily supporting, fighting with the Assad regime? How does that play out? How do we then talk about policy and politics and looking at polarizations? That's the kind of work that I look at. And I think that there is a need in academia to really rethink this question of resilience, but also to explain what are the aspects of politics that allows both central government and local government to learn and to adapt to the crisis, and also to look more closely at policy making when there is a deliberate effort for there to be a non-policy. And I argue that the Lebanese power sharing system exhibits this form of system upgrading by repositioning itself both within the international community and within local politics as a model of resilience. This sort of agreement, disagreement, this consensual agreement to disagree. At the same time, it's a deadlock that doesn't translate into inaction. It goes against everything analysts and political scientists have been thinking. Everybody thought that Lebanon would fall apart, both security-wise, politics-wise, socioeconomically, and yet we see this hailing of effort. I mean, we are, you know, Lebanon is a model of resilience. How is it? And we don't know that until we really look at the political dimensions of the last 6 years or so. I also argue that by the 7th year, this political ability to construct and construct itself is waning down. And I think we're starting to see signs of this inability to continue to have policy action in the absence of a non-policy. I mean, this is we've had UNHCR for the past 7 years. We haven't even signed the Refugee Convention. So how does that work along? And as the crisis enters its 7th year, is that political resilience waning down? I also argue that crisis at the central level, legislative, executive deadlock, doesn't need to play out as well as crisis of inaction. And the research that I'm doing, so I look at like a lot of ministry level programs and projects, a lot of funding that went directly into municipalities, a lot of ability to give a role for NGOs, non-state actors to play a role. So that deadlock, just because you don't have a functioning political system as per how functioning should look like, doesn't mean that there needs to be deadlock. How much time do I have? So just to say, the crisis in Syria and the Syrian crisis in Lebanon has revealed, in fact, that deadlock could be a safe haven for politicians and for the state. It is a haven that could avoid internal strife so far and could signal an agreement to postpone policy action without needing to go into complete inaction. And I will stop at that. I will just say that this research is ongoing. It's a year-long project, and I'm happy to say that this is a university research board funded project, so there is a role for universities in trying to do cutting-edge research that is as well very political. And I'm at the phase of also triangulating that with a media analysis and a media discourse as to how as well the international community, UN agencies, aid agencies, big European American politicians also enabled this sort of complacency of action and inaction, and then we'll move into field research early next year, and I hope that there will be still politicians and ministers around that we can interview, because we don't know what's going to happen, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. You highlighted this idea of the politics of non-policy, but that it may be reaching its limit in Lebanon. I think that's the new element of your research relative to previous papers. It is my pleasure now to invite Carlo Devillanova to the floor, where he's already sitting, maybe to the stand, where he will be heading. Carlo is very well known in the area of migration research. He is a professor of economics at Bocconi University, and he taught at many other notable universities, and an author of such a long list of publications that I'm not even starting to commence to read up. But giving instead the floor to him. We are grateful that you came to Beirut, Carlo, and take time to participate in this conference.
Thank you. This presentation is very limited in scope. What I'm going to do is basically to assess the causal effect of immigration on voting outcomes. This is the topic, and I'm going to look to use a spatial correlation approach, which is the one which has been used in the literature so far, and I focus on a single city, which is Milan. I also have to mention that I use a new instrumental variable approach. I will mention a couple of times this novelty of my research, but I'll never show nothing on the instrument. Having endogeneity, having a new instrument is something that is fundamental in economics to publish in A+ journals, so we need to have this claim. Then you can forget I have. And the main result is that in Milan, an increase in the share of immigrants at the local area has a positive effect on votes for anti-immigration parties and reduce also turnout, which I interpret as a protest vote. I think I can skip this next slide, but it's just a copy and paste from BBC, and I think it contains in a couple of words many of the things we are discussing today. First, nationalist parties are challenging Europe. This is crucial. And the rise in nationalist parties is linked to European migrant crisis, and also the fear of globalization and destruction of national identity. I think that the aspect I need more from this slide is that when they map these nationalist parties, for Italy, they use Italian Northern League. And so I don't have to justify so much why I'm going to use the votes share for Northern League in this analysis. The only thing I want you to notice that Northern League is just 4% of votes, so we are okay, very small percentage. In fact, you should know that Northern League was created in 1989, and at the very beginning it has a very strong secessionist stance in the program. So no way to have vote for Northern League in the south of Italy, and now it's changing. The political platform of Northern League is changing. Still, you can observe a very strong geographical divide, and the share of votes of Northern League in the north are not so right enough. And since the very beginning, he has a very anti-immigration stance. This is just an electoral manifesto who blamed the immigrants, Native Americans not to have stopped immigration at the time. And the claim is, thinks about it, it's better to think now rather than. And the empirical approach in the literature, what it does is to correlate the voting outcomes to the variation in immigrant settlement. So correlate how many immigrants are in an area to how many votes go to a particular party. This is, from a theoretical point of view, is a little bit ambiguous as a result. Somebody could claim that proximity increased competition in the labor market, in access to welfare, creating congestion of public services. There's some theory suggesting that proximity may reduce prejudice between group members, although conditions under which these theories are verified are very, very demanding, and I can see this condition to be met in primary school, for instance, but not anywhere. And there's also the possibility that just visibility of minority group matters. The differences across studies are just of the spatial unit of analysis, and in general I would say that the spatial unit of analysis is large geographical areas, regions, provinces. There's a nice study of Dominik, who is sick and on island in Greece, that is very, very close to what I'm doing, and he finds actually similar result, and I acknowledge his study because he's not here today. The second difference is the population understudy. Many studies look at immigrants, and I'm going to look at immigrants in general. Other studies look at refugees, and this can make a difference. There's a difference also in the possible solution to endogeneity problem, and I'm going to skip this issue, but be aware that identifying causal effects is fundamental for a policy perspective. And also there's some difference in result, with most studies finding that immigrants in the area has a positive effect on anti-immigration parties. So more immigrants cause more votes for the anti-immigration parties. And there are just a couple of sections. A study for Austria that find that immigrants cause a reduction in votes for anti-immigration parties. But this study is based on cross-section. It has not time variability, and this is a problem in this kind of literature. And also, there are two recent papers that find that the effect is not there for big cities. So the question in the empirical literature is why big cities are different. First answer, we people who live in big cities are more pro peace and love, let's say. And this, I would, from an econometric point of view, this is an omitted variable bias. The second answer is we in big cities are we had historical immigration flows, so we know that immigrants are not a problem for the integration. So we know the phenomena, and we are more pro-immigration. And this can be an answer. However, there's some recent research showing that anti-immigration sentiments are even stronger in locations who had previous immigration. So this doesn't seem to work. And the third answer that is my answer at the moment is that cities are segmented. I know very few things about Beirut. My guess is that not all Beirut is like this campus. And Milan in particular makes a lot of difference if you live in the center of Milan or if you live in the periphery. So it's a story of segregation, or if you want, it's a story of having no sense of taking the average immigration inflows in a city, which is made of very, very different districts. So this is the contribution of my analysis. I look on one single city, Milan, which actually is an important city. It makes 10% large Milan of Italian GDP. It experienced a dramatic increase on immigration, and it's unevenly distributed across districts. I'll show you a couple of graphs. I have very disaggregated data. You will see my unit of analysis, half square kilometers. I look at electoral outcomes in 4 different years. And as I already mentioned, the variable interest is the percentage of vote for Northern League and also turnout. And also there's a lot of variability within Milan vote share for Northern League. It ranges from 2.8%, depending on the year, 2.8% in the center of the city to 19% in the suburbs of the city. And as I said, there's a new instrument, but this is just if there's an editor here in the audience. This is the dramatic increase in immigration since 1987 to 2016, and you see Milan has experienced a dramatic increase in immigration, and immigration is unevenly distributed across the city. This is the unit of analysis of my regression. So I don't want to spend too much time. Just what I did is to correlate the share of immigrants to the share of vote in each one of these districts, and the change over time, controlling for the district fixed effect and for the other few variables that I could control for. And these are basically the results. And this is without controlling for endogeneity, but the results are pretty similar. What you get, and I'm going to quantify in the last slide, what you get is having more immigrants in the district cause a positive increase, an increase in vote for the Northern League, and a decrease in turnout. And conclusion. So my claim is that there's no big city difference at all. It's just that we were looking at big cities as uniform unit of analysis. Big cities are segregated entities. And there's a positive effect on vote for anti-immigration parties, Northern Leagues, and a negative effect on the electoral outcomes. The effect is large. I cannot show how I computed this number, but about 60% of the increase in the Northern Leagues vote share in Milan can be explained by the increase in foreign presence. I'm not able to explore the channels, but I think it's unlikely to go for a competition in the labor market and in the public services, because are so small areas that they do not define for certain local labor market, but also for public services, the area of interest is much larger. And so my feeling, although I'm not an expert on this topic, is that visibility matters. Visibility can generate a not causal association between economic crisis and the presence. And when we come to the policy implication, I give up. I just noted that there's a big twist between what we know in general, and for Italy in particular, on the economic consequences of immigration and the political effects of immigration. And I'm not easy answer to this problem, but I'm sympathetic with probably the marketing solution, that we have to improve information. We have to give easier communicable information, and probably also address distributional consequences of immigration, if any. And I think these are important as well, actually. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlo, very much. You brought in a new dimension, sort of making us a little bit disillusioned. We had hoped that big cities are different, and you tell us that on a closer look, actually, this is due to segregation, and maybe the underlying forces are some underlying forces at work which might surprise us in the future. Now I'm turned to our last presenter, with great pleasure, Nate Breznau. Nate is a newcomer to the ALUM family, if I may say. He's a postdoctoral researcher at Mannheim Center for European Social Research. A very young but already very distinguished researcher. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much for being here. My notes do not balance, so I will hold them by hand. Okay, does it work? No. So I want to bring some facts as much as possible, or the empirical aspect as much as I can here. And I'll start right off the bat by saying that I was inspired by this theme of universities responding. My normal area of research is very much in public opinion and attitudes. And I thought, well, one way universities can respond is the researchers at them can take up their own expertise and link it to things that are happening in current events. For example, the refugee crisis, or as many of you know, the refugee crises, if you like. So For starters, we've just seen a similar graph. Well, this is in Western Europe, which is very much an area of my research, and this is the percentage of foreign-born persons since 1962. It's increased dramatically. And what we know is that this is really at the center of group dynamics in, we can say in all countries, I think safely, but I'm talking about Western Europe. And I'm very happy that Professor Baalbek had given the keynote to talk about us versus them, this us versus them sentiment, which occurs. And it's not, I wouldn't say that it's caused by immigration, but immigration contributes to this us versus them feeling. You can think of children in a classroom, and when a new student comes in, what are they wearing? What is their hair like? They pick up on the differences and talk about the differences. And this is, in a larger context, you can think of a country. When foreign-born persons come to the country, they're very likely to have different clothing or a different way of speaking or different skin or hair, etc., right? And so these come to the center of what some social scientists discuss as social identity theory, or linked to national in-group discussions where people start to see, oh, well, if they're different, what am I? What's my group? And it helps fuel the construction of boundaries, and it leads to discussions about identity. And often what happens is scapegoating, this phenomenon of scapegoating. So suddenly there's these different people around, or slowly over time, maybe not suddenly, and they could be seen as to blame somehow for anything. If I feel my group's identity is weak, or I wish that I could be more a part of a stronger group, then it's easy to say, oh, well, this group is here, it must be their fault. Or I see immigrants as having, there was a discussion about smartphones or something, and then feel this envy maybe, or think, oh, there's resources, why doesn't my group have these resources? I think many of you are familiar with this kind of research. If we count the second generation immigrants, these numbers are very high in a lot of Western European societies, as over 30% in some of them. So one important phenomenon, let's say, that we just heard about are these anti-immigrant parties, or what some people call radical right parties, or far right parties, or neo-nationalist parties, or anti-immigrant populist parties. And the vote share in all of Western Europe has increased dramatically, and it very closely follows the number of immigrants. And populism is nothing new. It's been around, I guess, as long as politics. But this is a special form of populism. So not all populist parties are anti-immigrant, but parties that have a focus on xenophobia or anti-immigrants, or this us versus them, are populist as far as I can tell, or at least mostly populist. So they're capitalizing on votes. They're opportunist, in other words. Here's an issue that is already there, and they capitalize on it to get votes. And actually what I would say is that this creates an area in society where it suddenly becomes okay. It becomes okay to say, yeah, it becomes okay to be anti-immigrant. I'm in Germany, and for particular historical reasons, this is not okay, or this was not okay. After World War II, it was not okay to be xenophobic or racist, at least not publicly. Of course, people have their private opinions, but publicly it was not. This changed dramatically in the past couple of years. There's an Alternative for Germany party, and in this last election, it got almost 13% of the votes, which was totally unprecedented since World War II. But what happened is, over the past maybe 7 years is, you know, they creeped in and started these campaigns and started having slogans like this Native American. That's a very powerful message. And people, members of the public, see this and say, right, oh yeah, that's right. And suddenly they feel justified to publicly be anti-immigrant, to publicly express these things. And this then increases the vote share because it increases the salience of the boundaries, it increases the discussion. So that's interesting, but what I'd like to do is talk about the future and what does this all mean? And as I'm very much an empirical, a data scientist, as much as a social theorist, I would like to look at where is this going, and can make this. I will go very quickly with this one. Basically, I've put all the countries in Western Europe together, but if we look at each one sort of separately and try to fit a line into the relationship of the anti-immigrant vote share, does this have a, so the anti-immigrant vote share and the percent foreign-born. The red line is you could call this the correlation. Many of you are probably familiar with the statistic, the correlation, and we can think of it as something like how well the one explains the other, or how well one could be used to predict the other. It's very strong. It's very strong. And in some countries, it's very, very strong. For example, in Denmark. And in some countries, it's slightly less strong in Spain. But as a percentage, these correlations can explain between 50 and 97% of the variance in anti-immigrant vote share within these countries. Between 50 and 97%. That doesn't mean it caused it, but that means that the variance can be explained as such. This is a very powerful statistic. And in many ways, it means that if immigration continues to increase, the anti-immigrant party vote share should continue to increase. Well, why would immigration continue to increase? We've already heard about aging population. There's a need to fill jobs where there's not enough younger native-born persons to fill these jobs, period, full stop. Immigration is necessary. Also, the sustainability of things like pensions or other features of the welfare state depends on having a large and healthy labor market to pay into these systems. Immigration is absolutely necessary until we come up with a way to genetically engineer workers or something. There is no other human force to fill the need for labor. But at the same time, something else is happening, and that's the lower line, the green line. GDP growth has steadily declined over time since the World War II period. So when GDP growth was roaring, that's the percentage that the gross domestic product grows each year. How much does it grow each year? So the total of all of the productivity in a society tends to grow, at least since World War II, but this growth has slowed down. And now these are predictions from the OECD about what will happen. The aging population will continue to age, and given advances in healthcare and all of that stuff, will continue to live longer. This is a relatively stable prediction, unless we experience war. This is perhaps not as reliable of a prediction, but if things were to continue going the way they're going, GDP growth will be flat or continue to decrease. And this GDP growth links to the anti-immigrant parties. That's why I put it up here. So you have a formula here for increasing immigration and increasing anti-immigrant party votes. So what happens? Well, with these anti-immigrant parties, someone asked a question earlier that from the Open Society Institute that I found provocative, and That is that these parties do have support in the higher income brackets of society because they become natural allies. In modern times, they become natural allies with some neoliberal interests in reducing taxes, interests in reducing state services, and things like that. And so the platform of these anti-immigrant parties, we are the people and we should protect the people and be, you know, one nation and this kind of stuff, can be slightly adjusted and made into let's reduce taxes and make the rich richer without saying let's make the rich richer. So also these anti-immigrant parties are not finding natural allies on the left of the political spectrum, not often on the right, but sometimes. So center-right parties in multi-party governments may find themselves in a position where they have to work with anti-immigrant parties. Or the alternative is to adopt somewhat anti-immigrant platforms to get votes back. In Sweden recently, we've seen the Social Democrats take moves that are basically anti-immigrant in nature because their voter base has gone to the Sweden Democrats, the far-right anti-immigrant party, who's predicted to get over a quarter of the votes in the next election. And so even if the vote share perhaps decreases some, the movements are there to change the policies in a way that can actually reduce the welfare state, which can then also reduce social solidarity, and there are many other things to talk about with that. For example, here's just a graph. These are countries that have different shares of anti-immigrant parties, and here up top are those with the largest share. And this is, I bring in refugees because, well, it's a conference about refugees, but refugees are a tiny fraction of all foreign-born persons in these Western European countries, a tiny fraction, but they end up at the center of discussion. And so in many ways, it's a catalyst to increase the impact that the number of foreign-born persons may have. And here, the red line is the highest percentage. And here, we've seen a big change right here, or around here, in terms of asylum-seeking policies. So simple bureaucratic changes like limiting the number of applications processed per day have huge impacts. So it's not even a change in law, it's just a subtle change in practice. And so in Sweden, you saw the number of asylum applicants drop by like 85% in 1 year, not because of really any legal change. So this is a real outcome. This is a real outcome of anti-immigrant politics. I just want to try to add some, that there's causal, that there's real effects here. Okay, so what I do then is do a bunch of fancy, complicated, as you like, predictive stuff to what a child could probably have done, with a pen and just drawn the line a little further. But actually, so these are based on very complex predictive models that say this is a very likely outcome for the up till 2035, and that this would be something like what happens. Now, it's very different by country. That was this last slide. Someone brought up the UK. Let's just talk about it real quick. Great Britain. You have this UKIP vote, right? Big effect. And then it goes away because they left the EU. But it was about immigration. All of the studies. Fair enough. In the public's mind, you have. So then it's resolved, right? But it's not. There will still be immigrants, there will still be foreign-born persons in Great Britain, and the number will still continue to increase. So what happens if you extend this? This changes again. The public realizes, wait a minute, quote unquote, leaving the EU didn't take away immigrants. Why are there still immigrants here, right? And so this I would predict a return to anti-immigrant parties there. So I was challenged to make policy recommendations. I should stay like Carlo and stay out of that because I'm the scientist, but I've been motivated by some of the discussions we had yesterday. And I guess, I mean, the threat is war here. If the European Union breaks apart and everyone returns to nationalism, that's how World War II came about. Okay, there wasn't a European Union, but right, there's nationalism, populism. It's amazing how fast these things can break down. That's like the really extreme threat. So I would say a good policy recommendation then, in my opinion, is that these parties should be somehow declared unconstitutional. Any party that targets a marginalized group as its political platform should be unconstitutional. And you see there's all this research that if you put healthier menu choices in front of the public in a cafeteria, they eat healthier. Not because they set out for any particular reason, it's just that's what's on the menu, right? So if we took anti-immigrant parties off the menu, that would be maybe my big policy recommendation. And also, I mean, these places signed on in their constitutions, in their bills of rights, in the Geneva Convention, et cetera, they legally are supposed to be taking refugees, you know? And so when Sweden makes this small bureaucratic change, they're not doing it anymore. What does that mean? I mean, that's sort of, in a way, this is somehow against what these countries committed to, right? So thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for bringing in some fresh perspective, but also proving that communication is not a big obstacle, even for a modeler, an economic forecaster. Just raising the spectrum of war in Europe again, and advising that we should just bring the healthy green parties in to the menu, which is an interesting aspect for the Q&A to debate. So we are now looking forward to Carole Sharabati as a commentator on all the presentations, an impossible challenge. But Carole is a seasoned player in this ground. She is director of Political Science Institute at the Institute Saint-Joseph in Beirut, where she teaches a wide range of subjects, from statistics to game theory and macroeconomics. She's also a founding partner of CME Offshore SAL, a software outsourcing company with a large number of employees in Lebanon and worldwide. Carole, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I've been thinking ahead of this presentation and throughout the presentations how to tie up all the content. And actually, it seems to me that there are two parts here. There's one related to institutions and one related to politics. And the overarching problematic is what's the role of academia, research, and universities in this. So let's tackle each one of these questions, institutions and politics in relation to refugees, and then let's see where is the role of universities in each. I'll try to draw a bit on the Lebanese experience where most of my latest research has been based. So we'll start with the institution and with Carmen's presentation on policy and no policy and whether this has stopped or caused or helped resilience or not. We know that the lack of policy has triggered a huge flow of incoming refugees in Lebanon, but the policy paper was issued in 2015, was very clear and put in place some constraints on incoming refugees through payment of a certain amount of fees, through limitation to certain specific cases, through the sponsorship system and other mechanisms like that. Now, if we look at this policy paper that was initiated by the government, we can look at it in two ways. We can say, well, this has been very constraining. It has caused a lot of problems for refugees, including compromising their mobility, limiting their access to services, making them unable to find the sponsors, making them vulnerable to arrest. When arrested, they cannot count on their relatives because their relatives don't have the papers either. Many of them are still held in pre-trial stage. 1/3 of the refugees have been arrested because they don't have their paper and nothing else. So the policy paper which has caused that 80% of the refugees don't have their legal status now in Lebanon has caused a lot of problems. But then we look at this from the other side, which is resilience. Has there been any resilience, and how did the refugees respond to this? And there are some indications of resilience in the literature, in the research, and one of them, for instance, with respect to mobility. While refugees don't have their legal papers and have been constrained by mobility because they have to go through checkpoints, etc., they have managed to send their children and their wives to go work and to go access public services, etc. And this has often been called as a resilience of refugees. But at the same time, what is called resilience is associated with child labor and all sorts of reverse of relationship within the families and all sorts of associated problems. In the research we've done last year, we shows that while 70% of children aged below 13 where we managed to integrate them in schools, 90% of children who are aged 15 to 18 are outside schools. So, you know, resilience and sending the kids to work and integrating them, making them play the role of the parents who can't move around has actually had some drawbacks. Another example is the sponsorship system. The sponsorship system is required from refugees who want to renew their papers. And refugees have found workarounds because they don't have the network in Lebanon, so they went to their landlords and employers who very often provided them sponsorship. So this can be called resilience. Is it resilience? Well, at the same time, it does bound the refugees in a double subordinate relationship, and then it makes them vulnerable to a lot of abuses. A third example is job access. We know that refugees had to resort to the informal job sector, and we say, oh, not bad. There are 66% or 2/3 of the refugees who managed to find a job in the informal job sector. But is this resilience? Well, at the same time, all these refugees have $400 on average, and some reports say that 2/3 of the refugees are below poverty line because they're not able to get jobs that can sustain them. Another example is borrowing. Refugees manage to find informal ways of borrowing money which help them to survive. Is this resilience? Well, I don't know if this is resilience when we know that today debts from informal sources are on average as high as $1,000 a year on refugees. So no one knows how they're going to sustain this. Another example, some landlords in rural areas would allow refugees to work for their rent. So again, this is a mechanism of resilience. Well, is this resilience, and does it allow the refugees to free their cash for other purposes, or is it a situation that can lead to abuse because landlords occasionally will demand unpaid labor from their tenants? So this resilience issue is a very good example of the kind of problematic research questions that cannot be solved unless there is real serious research that is bound in hard data and in solid technical methodologies in order to draw the line. Where do we draw the line? What is resilience and what is not resilience? And the impact here is big because the impact is on the prospects of refugees and the impact is on future policies of government. We're very happy that there has not been big problems in the countries, and the Lebanese are seen as a host community that's very welcoming, but is this resilience or is this a timing bomb? So I think this kind of problems, this kind of problematics can only be solved by science and by academic research, which will link up with the real world and provide some light that can guide decision makers. So this is with regard to institutions. I tried to inspire myself from a case and the issue of resilience to show the importance of research and the role it can play. Now, what about politics? Well, elections is a very interesting topic. And we may have election or we may not have elections in May. But if there are elections, we are gradually going to start to wonder whether, as we get close to elections, the refugee issue is going to rise, and as the discourse is going to arise against refugees, or what's going to happen, or maybe nothing will happen. So this is very interesting, and the scenarios can be very different. Knowing from our previous elections, we can see two big, very simplified scenarios, but can help us think. The first scenario is that we may have a big coalition of parties, like we've seen them in the municipal elections, and we may have in front of them newcomers and reformist groups. And in this case, what is the impact on refugees? Well, if there are big coalitions of traditional parties, clearly these traditional parties may have some common interest in shifting the discourse to securitization. So security may take over economic and governance issues in their campaigns, which will possibly impact the discourse on refugees in a certain specific clear direction. The other scenario is that they split apart, and we have two big groups like we've had in the past, who are driven by geopolitics stance, which we're starting to see in the past few days. And in this scenario, clearly the geopolitics will also securitize the issue and instrumentalize the refugees. And somehow there may be some impact on the refugee discourse in a way that will not necessarily be constructive. So in both scenarios, the prospects don't look very exciting. And here comes the role of the university, because politics will never, especially in Lebanon, drive the debate and the race towards real technical issue on public policies and real strategies. What are we going to do with regards to education, to the job market, to et cetera, to the health and the services and the environment and the funding and the municipalities and the decentralization? And I think it's the role of the academics, the research, and the universities to bring the debate from a very position-driven political level to a very technical, data-driven, science-based level where there will be some real analysis that will provide some highlights for future decision. So these are my two takes on this, hoping to a bit add to the thoughts that have been presented and the material that was presented. I think universities have, to sum up, big roles in tackling these fuzzy topics like resilience that can be taken in any directions and used in any direction, and it has the mission to provide clear-cut and clear answers to these fuzzy problematics, but it also has the mission of bringing the competition, the race, or the politics from position-driven to very technical database and science-driven decisions. Thank you.
Carole, thank you so much for giving a framework at the end of the panel of thinking about all these issues in terms of distinguishing between institution and politics, and then really highlighting, I think, what is one theme coming out from this conference is that refugees and the refugee question is being instrumentalized everywhere by politics. It's being instrumentalized very clearly in Europe. It's instrumentalized in the US. It's instrumentalized now, you tell us here, where Lebanon has stood out in the past of being a real safe haven in terms of hospitality. Not that much government generated, but at the local level. In any event, I think we have time, you bear with us before lunch for a few questions, so fire away. Yes, please. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Dominik, Yale University. Question for Nate and for Carlo. How much of there's some anecdotal evidence, at least in the US, that first generation, second generation immigrants are themselves anti-immigrant, right? In your research, did you find that why immigrants are voting for anti-immigrant parties? And if so, what percentage of the anti-immigrant votes would be comprised by immigrants themselves?
Thank you. Let me collect a few more. I think Eleanor and then Marco.
Thanks. It's Eleanor Kaufman from Middlesex University and LSE. Again, a question to Carlo is that the spatial dimension figured there was a lot of research in a previous period of the big rise of the far right in terms of, for example, the British National Party in the UK and the Front National in France. And it looked at the fact that it wasn't the presence of immigrants in an area, but it was the fear of a sort of an invasion in a neighboring area, so that the highest anti-immigrant vote was not where the highest percentage of immigrants were, but nearby. And it was called the halo effect. So I'm wondering whether you've looked at any of this older literature which we could learn from, because I couldn't understand what was going on in Milan. You know, I could see the spatial variations, but I couldn't understand exactly what your argument is in terms of that.
Marco?
Yes. I have, well, the questions are for all of you. The first, from the beginning, about Carlo's presentation, you were speaking about the feeling against migrants or the fact that voters are worried, but about the fact that in Italy there are people saying, okay, too many migrants are occupying the place that are for Italians or for poor people in the labor market. But do you think that there is also a part of the voters that are the citizens that are worried because of the downsizing of the rights? Because now we saw that in the last 2 years, consequences of labor exploitation, but in the past where it happened only for migrants, now it started also for Italians. So do you think there could be a relation in this situation? Second, about the fact that
Marco, short.
Nate,
please.
yes. You said, Nate, that or not, I don't know the pronunciation, that migration is necessary. Okay, how to explain it to people? Because if they are without a job, how to explain that to them? That is necessary migration. And the last part is general. I think that politicians are not driving their communities. They are following the flow. But about a phenomenon that is not only an historical moment, but is part of our history. So that's my idea. So the responsibility of the politician that they don't want to prevent the fact that they could lose votes. They don't want to drive the boat, but they prefer to follow the flow.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Masa Mufti again. I feel that there's this missing link between whenever the context is Europe, you kind of tend to talk about immigrants. And as close as we come to Syria and talking about the hosting countries of refugees is more about refugee. And it's important maybe even to highlight the difference of immigrants and refugee, and even more, the root causes behind immigration and refugee. As Gibril, Mr. Gibril Faal mentioned, immigration is more about addressing the right to mobility. But when it comes to refugee, it's almost the right to live. And leading to resilience, it's almost just enforcing or ensuring that they are surviving. So there are really serious issues here that we still need to address at the policy and institutional level. First, the difference between the state of refugees and immigrants and the root causes. And maybe, when we address the root causes behind each, this could maybe lead to kind of open the debate of the shared values that we should have as countries to endorse and to adopt democratic and human rights across borders.
Thank you very much. We stop for this round, and I'd like to ask the panelists to address the questions shortly, in a short form, since we are just in between ourselves and the lunch, and then we can continue, of course, the discussion during the lunchtime. Yes, Carlo?
So very, very shortly, and actually I shortened also my presentation. So second generation immigrants, I have no possibility to address the question. So it's a very interesting question, but I have no possibility to look at it. Fear of migration in close neighborhoods. This is interesting literature I should have a look to, and we can talk later for bibliographic suggestion. However, keep in mind that as an economist, I already repeated several times, we are very focused on establishing causal relationship between variables. So I very much appreciated to receive bibliographic suggestions, but still what it differs in this analysis, the attempt to identify a causal effect. This has to be clear. The downsizing of the rights in the labor market, I think this is in the debate, this is in the mind of many Italians. My only claim is that cannot be the driving mechanism in my analysis, because the area are not defined at labor market level. But this is something that for sure is something that needs to be explored, and actually I'm exploring in separate work. And finally, the difference between immigrants and economic migrants. This is a very, very big issue, and I don't want to dismiss the importance of juridic definition or juridic consequences of the difference. Let me just claim that there's a continuum, in my opinion, between the very economic migrant, Carlo Devillanova, who, to improve his position, is going to Stanford, and the refugee who is escaping for persecution. There's a continuum, and in this continuum, there are some sectors, this continuum in which I don't see much difference of a father escaping from his country because he cannot buy the medicine to save his children's life. And let me also stress that at least in some countries, but I would say in most countries, the legal status of immigrant is rather fluid. There's a lot of transition across legal statuses. There's a lot of, so it's not attached, Carlo is tall, is small, it's something that can change over time. So again, my analysis is on migrant, but I think that the wording is important. We are using day after day more resilience rather than exploitation, and we are using more the word refugees instead of migration, but we should think a little bit of the consequence of this rewording of the problem, in my opinion.
Maybe I'll go next because I can speak to some of those things and not to all things. In Germany, the last election, the second generation of Eastern European especially and German return migrants were very much in favor of this anti-immigrant party, actually. And the anti-immigrant party itself had the second highest number of foreign-born politicians running for office. So it's quite ironic. So really, it's really like an anti sort of Muslim culture kind of thing underlying all of this. And in the UK, it was sort of different. There was this Eastern European immigrant within EU migrant issue that came to prominence in addition to the terrorism scare, sort of anti-Muslim culture scare. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, sorry, thanks. I just want to thank Professor Sharabati. I thought it was very spot on, her comments. I think what we're playing with in terms of the political, theorizing about political is probably heading in the direction that, you know, the Lebanese political system and its power sharing formula could have been an enabler in the beginning for some form of experimentation and flexibility, but could turn out to be a real constraint to policy making and to finding technical solutions. And this is where perhaps I wish to push the debate a little bit with Dr. Sharabati as to, I don't think that it's only that the universities should only play a technical policy role. I do believe that the university has a political role in convening both actors and discourse and pushing for a will not to instrumentalize and securitize, particularly around an election period. And that is also something that I want perhaps just to, moving forward, my policy recommendation would be to discuss politics and to bring political actors to the table and to have the technical solution ready. But first we need to work on the willingness to address this issue in its humanitarian and social and economic implications. Thank you.
Yeah, building on that and making a comment on some of the points. The interesting point is whether politicians, that was raised, whether politicians are driving or following. And it's interesting because looking on the local setting, you will see that the politicians do both. They may follow some trends and sometimes try to jump ahead or try to own some trends, but at the same time, they may create some trends and sometimes they may try to push the discourse into a certain direction. If you look at long-time trends in Lebanese political discourse, and you will see an interesting swing from governance to security, from economic to security issues. And you would notice that the rise of the security issues will come right after some turmoil or social mobilization or frustration expression. And this actually indicates that the politicians, whenever they can drive the agenda, they would. Don't forget also, there is also the relationship between the political sector and the media, which is the stronger the control of the media, the more likely they are to drive the agenda. And this is where the university can play an impartial role because the university has a research agenda and could look into areas that are actually very low in the public discourse and are yet very important. And that is what is interesting. Now, the immigrant and refugee distinction is also very interesting because it brings up the whole issue of what are the variables that would differentiate some of the researchers done in Europe with some researchers done in countries like Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon. And I think the context of the migration, the forced migration, is different. The conditions under which they have moved are different. The problematics are different. There may be some continuum, but somehow there may be some differences. And this in itself is an interesting thing to address because there may be some tendency sometimes to take some models. I think that international organizations are because there is no local research taking place, international organizations are often driven by research done in Western countries from their own experience. And this is not always transposable, not because the variables don't hold, because there are some additional variables and ingredients that are not there. And this in itself, is a reason for research to take place in local areas in order to also bring in some comparative statics in that.
Thank you so much, Carole. It's really the kind of the ethos of this conference and the whole ALUM framework to bring in researchers from all over the world and listen to top researchers from the West, if you wish, from advanced countries, and top researchers also, local, regional universities, and AUB and your universities clearly are the places to come. Can I just add one thing before I go? And thank you for your patience, because it relates to Carole's point that, of course, these big social economic shocks very often result in this type of, waves and sequencing and come with security and closing in and nationalism in advanced countries as well. This is not a local story. And I am making this point because it's important to remember that Europe has gone through a tremendous political economic shock with the global financial crisis, which hit a system, the Eurozone monetary system, which is half-baked. So with an institutional system and the political system which had vulnerabilities. And we forget that when we just look at migrants and maybe regress migration flows with the rise of anti-populism. As both researchers stressed, these parties take advantage and hijack the migration flows, but these parties are not created because of the migration flows. They also thrive on other factors. At least I think there is some evidence for that. Thank you for your patience. I give you all the time in the world to ask your question. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Ali Amhas, AUB graduate and analyst at the Civilian Partnership. I just have a quick question based on what Dr. Nate said. And excuse me, I'm using your first name because your second name is a bit hard to pronounce for me. But I was just wondering, you mentioned that part of the political rhetoric that's kind of justifying immigrants and refugees that typically preoccupy low-skilled jobs sort of economically justifies their existence in Europe right now. And at least from what I've read on predictions in AI technology, there are predictions that in the next 20, 30 years, a lot of these jobs will be technicalized, mechanized. For example, right now we're seeing self-driving cars. In 10, 20 years, maybe we don't need any more drivers or truck drivers or taxi drivers, and these are the jobs that often low-skilled laborers apply, in addition to construction and other fields. So my question to you is, how do you expect this sort of loss of the economic justification to affect the political rhetoric around refugees, and how the far right might make use of that? Thank you.
I think it's a brilliant question, and I ask all the panelists to chip in their views, because this is, I think, one of the fundamental questions of the future.
Well, I also didn't answer an earlier question. I don't know how to sell this particular topic, but I would say that a lot of these demanded jobs, many cannot be mechanized, like medical profession jobs, as far as maybe really far in the future, don't let me overspeak, but the doctors and the doctors' assistants and building and infrastructure type jobs. So they're really necessary for this serving the aging population. As far as having more consumers than, or having the balance of number of consumers versus labor market, people participating in a labor market. Yeah, that's also just a hard one to sell to any member of the public, I guess. But it's absolutely necessary, as far as I know. I'm a sociologist more than an economist, or the economy will just collapse.
I guess it's too difficult question to be answered, but my guess is that if this is the issue, then immigration is just one way to address a more general problem, that is the functioning of a new society in which the role for labor is lower with respect to other production factors. So it's a way of attaching a much more general problem, and I have no answer.
Yeah, I'll just To be brief, so I also think it's a great question. It's a difficult question. I've become, my new hobby is virtual reality games when I have time. And I want to defer your question, actually, and invite you to bring it to tomorrow's panel on the role of private sector, right, and innovation on immigration and refugees. I don't think political science has as advanced tools to, at least qualitatively speaking, to predict that sort of behavior. So, yeah, bring your question tomorrow.
That's fantastic. Carole, any final thoughts? Nope, it's good. It's a great way of ending this panel. Thank you so much. And the lunch is being served outside.
So just to, before we go, we'll be back for the second panel at 2:30.
Third panel.
Third panel, sorry, for the next panel.
Okay,
I want to say that AUB for Refugees hashtag has been trending #2 after Hariri hashtag. So, so I don't know which is more more tense now at the moment. So keep tweeting and retweeting.